Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Crysler. Each episode, we talk to business leaders and subject matter experts to learn about the challenges they've overcome and the challenges they still face. You'll hear fresh insights, real talk, and get inspiration to grow your business. Hey everybody, thanks for joining us. Excited to be welcoming back Sean Storms to the podcast. Sean is the founder of DCI, a growth advisory firm helping B2B companies create real marketplace separation and profitable demand without leaning on old sales and marketing tactics. After a 27-year corporate career, he built a proprietary framework focused on operational precision, continuous improvement, organizational fitness, and designing unmatched customer value. His system has helped clients achieve double-digit profitable growth and meaningful jumps in enterprise value within a year. Sean, thanks so much for coming back on the Everyday Business Problems podcast.
Happy to be here. And you know what? There are some clients I just learned who are in triple-digit growth over the past few years.
Awesome.
So I can't wait to talk.
Yeah, very cool. So for the folks that might be just tuning in to this episode, you and I recorded a previous episode. We kind of laid a bit of the groundwork for not just your framework, but kind of ultimately some of these results that you've recognized, a bit of history in terms of how you've come up through multiple organizations and learned all of this stuff, right? So this really is an extension of that, kind of diving in a bit deeper to unpack maybe some actionable things for folks that are listening to this to get the brain juices flowing. So excited to jump back in. Our last conversation, we talked a lot about kind of variation, whether it be random variation or kind of built-in variation. But the first question is really, how can a leader kind of tell the difference of some variation that should be expected versus something that's a real signal in terms of a systemic issue within their org?
Boy, is that a timely question. So we have to harken back to the last podcast where we spent a lot of time talking about W. Edwards Deming. He's pretty much cited as the guy who brought what we know today as Six Sigma to the forefront, right? And we're going back, my gosh, to the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, a long time ago. But Six Sigma distilled down to something that's really simple that we can all understand. And, I like to talk with my hands. We have variability in processes, right? It goes up, it goes down, no matter usually what you're measuring. And so to just pointedly answer your question, Deming figured out that there are some factors within a process. Let's choose one, a manufacturing process. We're making widgets. There's a whole bunch of factors, which he calls common causes, that are common to the process. And when you can differentiate between a common cause and something that's truly special, whether that's up or down on the chart, right? It falls outside of the system. And that's where you get real geeky about Six Sigma and, what are the control limits where 90 to 95% of all performance in that system is going to fall. But you've got to be able to recognize when something falls outside of the system, good or bad, so you can pinpoint it and say, hey, wait a minute, that's special. Why did that happen? And conversely, not to misinterpret a spike up or down that's still within the system, because if you start changing things and you misidentify that as something special, all you do is increase the variation. Does that make sense, Dave?
Yeah. I mean, it makes total sense, right? And I think, again, when we zoom out and we talk about these things, when leaders are, going down this pathway of maybe continuous improvement, or they've, settled on a maybe lean or Six Sigma, right? This is, I think, a bit of the misnomer behind, why we can't just plug and play something very specific, a tool, let's say, without having a broader understanding, to your point of, all of the processes and variation that's inherent within those processes. And then again, how do we define things that fall outside of that, right? So whether it's you, whether it's me, whether it's some, other folks that are out in the world and marketplace today, I do think that there's a specific gap with some folks that have maybe only learned either a specific discipline, a specific tool set where I talk a lot about, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So, I love the way that you unpacked it, and I think it kind of sets up, another great question, which is, how can leaders um, best understand or start to learn about their entire business being that system, right? And more from a 30,000 foot view, let's say, than maybe down to the Six Sigma, process variation. How can they start to be considerate of that and not just jump into, hey, we're going to do lean stuff, we're going to do Six Sigma stuff. How do we get them, the folks that are listening to this to zoom out and to be thinking about their business through this lens to begin?
I appreciate that. So it's two or three things. One last piece on the last question, though. The last thing you want to do is to play whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
So, hey, we fixed these three things, and then two other things pop up. That's the beauty of understanding now the question on the table, which is how can, especially senior leaders, if not those leading departments, managers and VPs and people like that, is where do we start? Well, being a guy who partially has a continuous improvement brain, we always have to go to root causes, right? You know me well enough to know I'm a big fan of saying, when problems exist, and I'm talking about mistakes, errors, failures, when problems exist, the worst thing you can do is go to solutions. But boy, that's America. Gotta have it done fast. It's depending on your generation, it's the John Wayne mindset, or Bruce Willis in Die Hard, or whoever, the Marvel folks. It's we gotta fix it now because that's who we are in this country. And the hardest thing, as we go down this road to answer this question, is for senior leadership especially to say, let's not create a culture of celebrating problem solving. It's not what we want. And most do, right? They're handing out, gift cards and attaboys and for solving a problem, but they rarely get to the root cause. And my point is this: that takes time. When Deming was brought into the country of Japan after World War II in 1945, it took 5 years to get Japanese, the Union of Scientists, Engineers, and Business Owners to understand what he was talking about. And then it took them 23 years before they started making inroads into the largest market in America, which was the US. So we need, as senior leaders, to say, if we're truly going to take time to identify root causes of problems, we cannot pressure people to say, have it done next week.
Yeah. I think that's one of the biggest challenges, I'd say just largely in the market today, right? Everybody wants it yesterday. And I think, there is certainly a balance to be struck between solving problems, but thinking through, to your point, what the specific root causes are, what the contributing factors are. And then another piece that took me a really long time to learn personally was, on the tail end of that was actually testing, right? Verifying, introducing failure to understand, have we actually solved this problem, or are we just really kind of lying to ourselves or fooling ourselves that, we've moved the needle somehow? Whether that was due to some other, constraint, time, money, what have you. But, just again, going through the motions. I think there's another aspect, and it kind of ties into another question. But, I think the other aspect that I'm going towards is what that does culturally, in terms of that celebration or kind of that quickness that, what have you seen from your experience, how that impacts the culture more broadly, right? Because what I'm getting to is this idea of conflict and within culture, how that ultimately impacts the organization as well. So I think that's a good starting point, but ultimately want to work towards this idea of, healthy conflict and unhealthy conflict within an org.
Yeah, well said. Going back to what you said a moment ago about testing, for those listening or viewing this, just do yourself a favor. Go to your favorite search engine and put in plan, do, check, act. Think of it as a circle. It's plan, do, check, act. Now, some of that check, the C in it, the PDCA, that can also be study or test, right? Plan, do, study, act. This is what, again, Deming brought to the Japanese. You got to plan it, you're going to do it. Now we got to measure it, study it, check it, test it before we act. So I wanted to say that there's a system of how continuous improvement occurs. And that is the biggest one you'll hear about is plan, do, check, act. So they can study that and then go look at it themselves, or they can search it. The cultural part on impact is really interesting. The companies, the organizations who do this right, ask 5 senior leaders how you define culture. Trust me, you're going to get 5 different answers. Yeah. I happen to subscribe to this, just personal opinion. I believe it is how you reward people and how you compensate them. And the best companies that I have seen that have done this right, they reward the continuous improvement, the work under the heading of continuous improvement, that they have gone through classes to understand. And by the way, they don't have to be full-blown certified black belt Six Sigma people.
Yeah.
Any company I walked into that I personally led and either saved tens of millions of dollars or dropped tens of millions of dollars to the bottom line, never once brought Six Sigma into it. It was literally root cause analysis. Let's have some discussion about it. Let's measure it and test it. Yeah. And go from there. Let's go get the low-hanging fruit, and then we'll bring in all the black belts and let them fine-tune it.
Yeah.
So the impact culturally is, what do you believe in? If you believe in compensating, on profit, look, no offense to all the private equity folks out there, but they're in a bind. There's trillions of dollars sitting out there that are hung up because they can't get these portfolio companies where they need them to be. And I'm dealing with some of them, by the way.
Yeah. Yep.
You've really got to figure out culturally, so it'll impact culturally, what you believe is really important. And this issue of continuous improvement, as you and I have talked about in the last podcast, is a force multiplier. It is the gift that keeps on giving. So why not go there? It solves every problem that a company has.
Yeah. I think specific to the PE point, right? A lot of folks in that world, with some models, right? Like there's a variety of PE models. So I certainly don't want to put everybody into this category, but I think inherently what they run up against, right, is the idea that they're going to turn and burn these companies, and ultimately, what kind of capacity do they have for slowing down to speed up, right? So if they're in alignment with that, I know some PEs, are buy and hold forever, which is interesting, but, it's a cash generating machine when you do these things right, when you've bought in and to your point, from a specific culture perspective, you're compensating based on those activities, based on what we believe in, as a long-term investment into this company, and the future of the folks that are within it. So I think sticking on the culture theme for just a second, I'd love to hear your perspective again, back to this idea of, positive kind of cultural conflicts, right? And what I really mean by that is the ability for team members to have enough trust within the organization to speak their mind, to share ideas, without kind of fear of retribution. And I know you've been into a lot of companies that, have either had to transform specific from that culture perspective, and you've probably seen both sides, both sides of it. So I'd love to get your take on that, just in terms of your experience, what you've seen out there, how folks can navigate it, and how ultimately it, goes to, this is just one more building block,
Sure. So it's interesting. One more time, I'm going to go back to Deming and for your viewership. Deming's 14 points for management that can be pulled up anywhere on the web. Deming's 14 points for management. That's it. You'll get 14 points. For those who have never been exposed to it, they might go, what the hell? My favorite point out of the 14 is I think it goes to the crux of what you're talking about, Dave, is point number 8, which is drive out fear. How many organizations do we see who hit people over the head, discipline them, fire them, whatever it might be, because whatever, they've made mistakes, who knows what it is. 90 to 95% of all problems, errors, and mistakes are due to the system, not the employee. That's proven. And so in terms of, culture, do we allow that friction? Do we not only reward it, but do we, what's the word I'm looking for? Do we encourage it?
Yeah, celebrate it.
Celebrate it. I mean, whenever we have our one-on-ones with our folks, whether that's monthly or quarterly, at worst, quarterly, I've walked into places where people haven't had a one-on-one in 2 years. I mean, it's just fascinating. But you sit down with them, and I've had this conversation and said, you're like a yes man to me, and that doesn't make me feel good. I would say to a VP, let's say who reported to me, you got to call me out sometimes. I'm not always right. I know that. So you have to create that kind of a culture where they feel safe bringing those things up. And the way they'll feel safe and comfortable is because the people who get rewarded, whether that's through compensation, short-term recognition, promotions, right?
Yeah.
We've got to prove it in very meaningful ways, and that will start to allow the culture to do what you're suggesting.
Yeah. No, I like that. I'll share this with you. One of my old bosses used to have this great saying about, he never wanted to be surrounded by a bunch of bobbleheads. And, it just is always, it's so visual, right? Because everybody could see, like, oh, yes, okay. And it was always just one of his, little phrases that he would share. But it's so appropriate because ultimately you think that you're kind of getting consensus, but you're not, right? It's just, all of the decisions are on you and you shoulder them, good or bad. And what you perceive ultimately, and again, I'm sharing this from my perspective, having learned these lessons, doing things the wrong way. But what you ultimately end up realizing is that, you're not really getting consensus. You're not really moving, everybody together. You're creating a lot of, kind of dissension and issues internally with the thought that you're actually doing something, right? Like that's the most ironic part. It's like, you think that, everybody thinks this is a grand idea, right? But ultimately is everybody's acquiescing and because there's not enough trust there for probably a variety of reasons to say like, hey, I think we should do this, or that's a bad idea and here's why. So yeah, I really love all of what you just unpacked there.
Well, we are for sure on the same page. May I give you one real life example if I'm brief?
Yeah, would love it. Yeah.
So here's, again, culturally how you can make this happen. I had mentioned that I have been tabbed from the outside to come in and lead a company. So most recently, let's call it in the last decade, right? I have my company, I do what I do, but once in a while, I'm asked to come in, whether it's 8 months, a year, 2 years, whatever. And nobody had a one-on-one. There were probably 50, 60, 70 salaried employees. I took the first 2 months of that job and sat down with each of them. And what came out of it was this, and I'm going to backtrack just a bit. I don't suggest any senior leader who's about to hear this to jump into the deep end of the pool immediately, but here's... Once you have this,
maybe.
Once you have this down and you feel comfortable with it, I remember telling the owner, who was off to the side, gave me full rein, and I said, I will know that I have this thing running efficiently and profitably the way I want it when I walk in every morning and I have no clue what the hell is happening around here. And that really makes some people's heads explode. And here's what I mean by that. So I had all those one-on-ones. And across different departments, there were three people that when I asked the question, right, all independent of one another, when I asked the question, if you were to stay with this company over the next however many years, what's the dream job? If you could just get on a whiteboard and say, here's what I'd love to do, then all three of them answered something similar that sounded like this. I'd love to be part of a small team that solved all of our external and internal problems as a team. I was like, oh my gosh, this is like Navy SEAL Team 6. And so we did that. And those three had free reign across the company. I told them to be very respectful to department heads, but I also told the department heads they got free reign. So you got to open up everything to them when they come in there. We don't have enough time to talk about what they accomplished, but I'm telling you, about 6 months later, I would walk in, I'd sit down with them or a department head, and I'd say, so what's happening? What's new and different? And they'd say, well, we started this, we did that, here's the impact, here's what's going on. Dave, I had nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
Easiest job I ever had, and everything went the right way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing what happens when, you truly are empowering people to do their best work. I think a lot of people hear stuff like that and they get confused about what it takes to, ultimately to execute on something like that, right? And it's not that you are not providing some guardrails, as like provide the goal and the bounds, as I like to say, right? So you're still very much involved, but from a completely different perspective where you're getting alignment, you're talking about bigger vision goals. You've already settled on why are we even, why do we get up and do this in the first place, right? Those are all kind of table stakes when you're doing this type of work. But often it's those specific things that people gloss over, don't recognize, and they jump in the deep end of the pool and say, we're going to identify our own SEAL Team 6, and we're just going to let them,
Right.
go wild here, right? But no guardrails, no kind of greater purpose guiding what we're doing. Right. So I think maybe one of the things, and we touched on this in the first episode, but I'd love again to maybe just dive, a bit deeper into that, like talking specifically about that purpose and this idea, and maybe even polling the team to say, like, what's the output of of that very specific question to them? Hey, why are we even doing this stuff, right? How can we utilize that as not just an alignment tool, but for folks that are out there to get a pulse on where they really stand with this stuff? Because I would venture a guess that most organizations are not aligned on that. They don't really know. It's going to be some idea of, we want to make money, or we want to support our people, or, fill in the blank.
And so we're talking about purpose, right?
Yeah.
It is easily, I believe, as a guy who, like you, came up through organizations and learned about sales, operations, continuous improvement, you name it, I believe it is the most powerful concept that we have in business, and also the most misunderstood. Purpose, as you said, is the reason why the company exists, and the difference it's trying to make in people's lives, usually the customers' lives. You and I in the last podcast talked about how the most iconic B2C companies, that's what they were founded upon. We've all watched the stuff with Steve Jobs and a bunch of others, right? If you listen carefully, they're talking about Steve Jobs, like when I become engaged with a company with what I do, we not only talk about purpose, mission, and core behaviors, we talk about core obsessions. The best of the best have two core obsessions, and it gets to your question. Jobs cared about two darn things: design, customer experience. Design, customer experience. That was it.
Yeah.
So everything was driven through the organization, but that came from purpose, which was think different. So if you look at Quick Trip we have here, which is a convenience store, gas station. They're pretty much most of the country, not all the country. But Quick Trip is a big one around here. They care about two things: speed and cleanliness. Speed and cleanliness. For the longest time, I would joke with people giving keynotes, and I'd say, my wife is real particular about where she'll go to the bathroom in public.
Yeah.
And she would go to a Quick Trip any day of the week because the damn places were clean. It's a gas station, right? It's pretty interesting. This issue of what you believe with purpose, out of mission, core behaviors, and core obsessions, the only one that never changes, it is there in perpetuity, is purpose. So you'd better get it right from the get-go, which is why, at least when I work with senior leadership on the company's purpose, it can take anywhere from a month. I've seen it last 3 months, and these are meetings twice a week, where they finally can come to an agreement on those two questions. Why do we exist? What's the difference we're trying to make in people's lives? But when you get it, and we gave some parameters in the last podcast about how you can
Yeah.
start to develop that.
Yep.
That is the North Star that any decision in the company is made. It is compared against that statement.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, to your point, I think this goes back to where we started the conversation in terms of, slowing down to speed up, and everybody's in a race to, cross it off the list, and move on to the next, problem, challenge, what have you. But spending some time on this, utilizing, our good friend ChatGPT as, maybe an entry level brainstorming session, to do some of that. But whatever the methodology, right? Whatever the framework to start to dig into this stuff, I think it's such important work. And I'm super appreciative to you for sharing some of those resources, because it's really made me even think about, my business specifically and the things that I'm doing. And so, beyond B2B, beyond the B2C stuff that we've done, right? These are all topics, all things that are really just about, learning and expanding your knowledge base, and thinking through what we do on a day-to-day business business day through a different lens. And I think everybody can find value in that, regardless of where they're at in any sort of transformation. I think we get so mired down in the weeds, if you will, of this problem or this priority, and it's really difficult to zoom out and to think about that, in a meaningful way, right?
Yeah, agreed. Think about this. Have you ever had anybody cross your path in your life whose back was out of alignment?
Yeah,
How do they feel?
yeah, pretty miserable usually.
Would you personally drive a car where the front end was out of alignment?
No.
Probably not. The one thing that I will take the heat for this, that I don't think I really talked a lot about in the first podcast, was this is front end stuff. It is fascinating for me to watch my clients, once they develop the front end, those three things that I kept seeing in B2B that they didn't have, that are all front end stuff. You mentioned them again at the front end of this podcast. It's this issue of operational precision, right? How do we get the waste and rework out to make things simple and efficient? And it's really about the customer experience. How do we create organizational fitness, the whole purpose piece and so forth? And really the creation of an unprecedented value proposition. If those three things happen on the front end, I'm telling you right now, anything else you do going forward will be so optimized and will work so much better than if you don't do those things. It's like driving a car where the front end is out of alignment. It doesn't matter if you put the nice stereo system in.
Yeah.
The car's still out of alignment. It doesn't matter if you put in leather upholstery.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great analogy for it. I think some of what folks, especially in kind of long-standing businesses, right? Folks that have beat the 10, the 15, the 25-year mark. I think especially will resonate with that, because I think for a lot of those folks, especially as they've hit maybe a second generation, whether it's a family-run business or a second set of leadership coming into that organization, whether it be external or internal up through the ranks, right? I think those are the types of companies that, if you're zooming out and you're being ultra critical, can feel some of that, that those tires wobbling a bit, at high speed, right? Like, ask one of those companies, hey, what if we could wave a magic wand and increase revenue 30%? What would happen? Right? If they're being critical and very, forthright, most of them will say, I don't know if we could handle that. Like, I think some stuff would start to break.
I
Right?
I think you're absolutely right. Take something as it's certainly not small, but just a microcosm of this whole thing we're talking about is why in B2B is pricing always such an issue?
Yeah.
Why is it always such an issue, Dave? Why do we have to sharpen the pencil, do the RFQs, the RFPs? The waste and rework is enormous. So that's one of the things, right? 20 years ago, I'm looking at it going, why does that occur? Well, it's because, including some companies that I was running, we don't stand for anything. We're not operationally precise. So the customer experience kind of sucks.
Yep. Yeah.
Organizationally, we're all messed up internally. And believe it or not, the customer can feel that externally. And the value proposition is kind of meh. So you got all three of those things. The only thing that these customers have to do is pit us all against each other and beat us up over price.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great way to break down the issue. I think to compound that, right? Another, I think we touched on this a little bit, but I think to compound that and to kind of start to bring this home is this idea then that we start to solve these issues, kind of in silos, right? So Dave has, a department or a couple of departments that report to him. And so I go on this mission to increase our efficiency because, maybe I'm customer facing, right? So I've got, customer success and I've got estimating, let's say, and I'm getting all of this feedback externally. I can see the issues internally across our team. So, I start to research the tools and I go down this pathway of, trying to identify waste and rework. And, we start to talk about all these things. But because it is in such a silo for my area of responsibility, there's no greater impact because we're not driving towards, again, why are we doing this to begin with? How do we last another 20, 30, 50, 100 years? Right. So I'd love to hear your perspective on that. In terms of how folks can, start to identify that within their organizations, because I would guarantee it affects the vast majority of organizations that are out there. How can they go about identifying some of that? And then what are those entry points for a conversation to say, guys, we need to start to zoom out a little bit here. And instead of, being so focused, down at the floor, right? We need to start looking at that 30,000 foot view first, right? Because that's the whole speed up, slow down to speed up aspect, I feel like.
I'm not placating you when I say this. That's one of the most intelligent questions I've ever heard because I wasn't quite sure where you were going with that, but now I get it.
Yeah.
We need to do a mini deep dive into this. You tell me, how do most organizations hire for the VPs of particular departments, operations, HR, IT, sales, marketing? How are they hiring for those roles? You tell the audience.
Yeah, I mean, typically it's going to be, skill based, right? Like they're looking for a particular set of skills. Generally, it is based on, years of experience and delivering some result, right? But I would say it's delivering the result within that area of expertise, very narrow.
So, of course, you're absolutely right. Put 7 of those people in a room. Do you think each of them think they're probably the smartest person in the room?
Yeah.
Probably. So when Deming told me personally before he passed many years ago, and he said, Sean, he goes, the greatest source of variation of chaos that's really hurting the P&L inside of all size companies. He goes, it's not in manufacturing down on the floor. It's not in the processes. He goes, it's in the boardroom. He goes, it's in the C-suite for the reasons you just described to the audience. And so if each of them are being rewarded with wonderful compensation packages and all these other things, and they've been recruited, which makes you feel good, right?
Yeah.
And you're brought into the company to make your mark on that department or this company. Do you think that that's conducive to, we're all going to take off our department hats and it's all for one and one for all?
Yeah, I'd say a bit of a struggle.
So I mentioned this company where I just gave you the whole thing where I went in and right how I had all the one-on-ones. We had a real problem that exists in almost every B2B company you'll see. The sales head and the marketing head, department heads, they do this. Okay. At the company I went to, both of them were underperformers. So I fired them both and I found a guy who was a hybrid, which I am. I only know about 5 of us who could do sales and marketing, and they understand that this thing should be integrated. So I bring in one guy, saved a salary to start with, a big salary,
Yeah.
and there was no friction. So, so tell me why there was no friction. That's right, because there was one person leading both. And I gave him a higher calling, which was, now you and the new head of operations, I need you guys to spend time in each other's operation so you can give feedback, and I am going to pay you as such. And everything went well. The other example I may have told is when I was at a big multi-billion-dollar industrial supply company, and I got the okay from corporate to say, can I pay at least 51% of the salespeople's their compensation package on them bringing back observations and maybe even insights into customers so we can develop a killer value proposition, the whole unspoken need versus the spoken need. There's a way to do this, how to break down silos. And one of Deming's 14 points is break down barriers between departments, which is what you're referring to. So it comes back to purpose. Purpose, and then what are we holding them accountable to? Every place I've ever been since I learned all this, when I had my one-on-ones with my direct reports, all the department heads, tell me last week how you helped fulfill the purpose. If they couldn't give me at least one example, black mark,
Yeah.
check mark, no, not good.
Yeah, I
Not
love
good.
that. I mean, it's just such a different level of, accountability. And I think most folks love to jump to the accountability without providing enough clarity or consistency on the front end of that, right? And so I think a couple of really smart things that you said in there in terms of, actionable things for folks to be thinking about and ultimately take into their org. Right. Number one is again having the bigger purpose, having the that North Star defined that everybody can be beholden to, everybody is understanding. But beyond that, I think it was literally setting the expectation in your example between, your hybrid sales and marketing person and operations. How are they interfacing? How are they, collaborating? How much time are they, physically spending in each one of those, areas? And it's not so much about looking for folks that maybe don't have a skill set, right? But it's looking for folks that have a skill set and that are also open to this idea of collaborating. Again, how do we ultimately drive towards, this greater purpose?
Yeah, without a doubt. And that leads us down the road of what comes after purpose. Well, that's mission. You read enough of my stuff to know that you can make that annual strategic planning pain in the butt thing, you can make it go away. You
Yeah.
don't have to do annual strategic planning. If you have purpose, well, now comes mission, right? I always say EOS has got it backwards. They start with mission and they don't even mention purpose. Mission is the short-term core strategy that fulfills the purpose. And so once you fulfill that 6 to 9 month mission, which is a strategy, strategically, what are we going to work on?
Yeah.
Could be improving the customer experience, or we got to fix the sales pipeline process, or whatever it might be, operationally, right? Once that's done, you go to the next one. And when that's done, you go to the next one. And when that's done, that's continuous improvement. Why are we doing strategic? I get calls all this time of year, November, December. Oh, we need help with strategic planning. Why? Well, aren't you doing that? Isn't your mission? See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That's the other thing that builds camaraderie. When you have the higher cause, this true north, which is purpose, and now together, these 7 or 8 people in the C-suite say, okay, here's all the things we could be working on first. What helps fulfill the purpose most? It is this mission. Great. 80% of all our time, everybody, take off the hats. We're all going to go to work on this for the next, 6 to 9 months,
Yeah.
measure it, right? Set up all our KPIs, and we're going to fix it. And then we go to the next one. Well, that also breaks down barriers and silos.
Yeah. Yeah. I couldn't agree more. I think I got one more more philosophical question for you. I'd love to get your perspective on this.
Uh-oh.
Having been around for for a while, right? How, do you think that are just as general as we've gotten closer to technology, as technology has advanced, as we now have literally everything at our fingertips via phone, do you think that a lot of the kind of angst that we have in terms of this problem solving and this speed, this kind of insatiable need to just keep going and do and faster, right? Do you think that that has increased over the last 30 years that you've been doing this, 40 years that you've been doing this? Did we have more patience when you were coming up and you were learning about some of this? Because I think it's a really one, I'm just super curious to hear your perspective. But beyond that, I think that with the folks I'm talking to and the things that I see, it's this constant battle of, again, back to the slow down to speed up. And I know a lot of people use that phrase. But I do think that we get so rushed to feel as though we're making progress when reality is that we're not, where it's just all busy work. We're just keeping ourselves busy. We're not truly moving the needle. And if we really did just slow down a bit and be very intentional with our actions, that we would see the result 10x, 20x. So I'm just curious, like, have you seen that change over the course of time, and maybe some things to think about, through your lens?
Thank you for asking again. That's a big, messy question, but my short answer is this. Sadly, I haven't seen it change at all for this reason. There are two forces at play, Dave. Again, just my humble opinion, what I've seen,
Yeah,
but I've seen a lot. Higher education, they still don't get it. What they're teaching, whether it's just in your bachelor's program or your MBA program, and what they're teaching senior leaders. I've talked to leaders, CEOs who have been through Kellogg, Northwest School of Management, so on and so forth.
yeah,
It is two things. It is higher ed and what they're being taught, and what their mentors, this legacy thing that perpetuates itself. And it goes back to what you're saying. It is what Deming warned the Western civilization of, right? As Japan was starting to eat our lunch in the 70s and 80s, he said, this focus on short-term thinking is going to kill the middle class in this country. And it did.
interesting. Yeah,
Manufacturing went overseas.
yeah,
So that's the big picture, because you asked a big picture question. I think if they slow up, it is an issue of what you said. You've heard me say this. Too many companies, and especially senior leadership, they don't understand what's happening inside the company, processes, how things work. And they also don't understand their customers at all. I have made joint calls with customers. I'm an outside guy. Who's he? Well, he's the consultant that's working with us. And I sit in front of one of their customers and I go, hey, when we walked in, I saw this and this. What's that? Just asking silly questions. We walk out of there and the VP of sales goes, geez, I've been calling on these people for 10 years. I never knew that. You know why? Because you're tasked with revenue. That's just a result. Let's go help them. Stop
yeah.
selling, start helping. So the big picture is, I think what's causing this it's short-term thinking caused by mentors and higher ed,
Yeah,
and
it's a great.
how they're rewarded.
Yeah, it's a great perspective, because I think a lot of people, kind of go on the crutch of the access, right? We have access to learn how to do literally anything. We have a coach now built into, the AI chatbots. So there is no shortage of access.
Right.
But I think, again, back to your point, it's really comprehension. It's having this really intimate understanding of what is happening externally, what's happening internally. How do we bring those two things together? And I don't think, there's certainly reference material, right? But there aren't a lot of folks that are talking about this holistically in the B2B space, which again is just why I appreciate, our connection, the conversations that we had. I'm always learning, things from the stuff that you put out, and obviously through our conversation. So really appreciative of that.
Well, you're very welcome. I will throw this out as at least the last part of the question you had asked. And, there's no doubt, as you and I both know, that AI is here to stay. Who knows what it's going to look like month to month as it progresses so rapidly.
Yeah.
But because companies, and especially their salespeople in B2B, are so not focused on uncovering the unspoken need, ChatGPT isn't going to help you.
Yeah.
There are so many companies in B2B that are not purpose-driven. ChatGPT is not going to help you. You know me, I'm not a rainbows and unicorn kind of guy. I mean, I love people. I want to see that the organizational fitness part work, but I'm an operator at the end of the day. The damn thing's got to make money.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's not good for anybody, but that's just a result. We have to bring all this stuff that you've been kind enough to give me the floor on 2 podcasts. I keep saying to the outside world, we need to bring some humanity back into this thing. Customers, people, silos, there's a lot that needs to be done that's been ignored that AI can't help you with.
Yeah. I love it, man. That's, yeah.
Dave, last thing I say, and this will fry your brain. You'll be thinking about this. Think about all the employees who are out there listening to this right now who may feel at their company like they're already ignored, treated like a number. Now you've introduced artificial intelligence. How do you think they feel now?
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. I mean, a couple of my good friends that are doing a lot of kind of digital transformation, change management conversations, right? Put a bunch of content out, are talking about that very thing, right? How we're even introducing these tools, right? And again, to your point, where we're even meeting people to begin with, right? Right. The other day, I don't want to call out specific situations, right? But the other day, Cloudflare was out, right? And so I jokingly made the comment. I said, well, gee, I wonder how many, AI agent call centers are answering phones this morning, for all the customers that they're trying to field,
Sure.
right? Because again, it gets back to this idea of, just because we can doesn't mean we should. And I love that aspect of, bringing the humanity back. I think that all of the things that are tactile, right? It's like, I grew up in print. So for me, it's a lot like print, print for the longest time. Everybody's going digital, we're never going to, printers are going to be out of business, right? And what's all the rage these days, direct mail, because it's tactile, right? People want people, people want to have a conversation, want to get to know somebody. And I think, that's another reason I love the stuff that you're putting out there, because it's always from that perspective. It's how do we drive improvement? It's talking to the people that are doing the thing. It's bringing people together and getting them some alignment. So Sean, thanks so much. I want to give you an opportunity to just let folks know if they'd like to reach out and connect with you. Where's the best place for them to find you at?
So when I say we put out a lot of content, right, it's not just me. There's a kind of a consortium behind this, but we put out a lot of content. So if you're not following me on LinkedIn, I would suggest you do that. But certainly DM me if you just have questions or want to know more information. There's a whole system behind this. We had talked about, we've got a full-blown learning management system behind this. Videos, worksheets, the whole 9 yards. So you can either do that, or certainly email me at Sean, that's SEAN, at the DCI, that's the Demand Creation Institute, Sean at the DCI.co, not .com. And just, I love talking. It's how you and I got to know each other. We just got to talking.
Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect. So that's kind of the thing. If this has intrigued anybody, and if you go to the website, right, the DCI.co, lots of customer testimonials, lots of stuff to look at. It's thought-provoking, but I can tell you right now, in the world of B2B, where most companies are living in a world of sameness, I've worked very hard for a long time to help break companies free from sameness and so they can flourish.
Love it. Now make sure to put all of that info in the show notes for folks that can reach out to you to connect directly. Sean, again, thanks so much for coming on the Everyday Business Problems podcast.
Thank you so much, Dave. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening today. If we brought you any value, please rate, subscribe, and share our podcast. Also, be sure to connect with us on social media by searching @The Crysler Club. Until next week, I'm your host, Dave Chrysler.